Billy Shore and I have known each other a long time, so we're going to talk about his quite remarkable book, The Imagination of Unreasonable Men, which actually sounds like a great title for my autobiography.
I knew you related to the title.
And his books are over there. Are you selling them, giving them away?
I don't know. Somebody's selling them, but
Billy and I met in 1984. I was governor at the time. And, was one of the, I don't know, 2 or 3 people who endorsed Kerrey Hart.
You were the only governor.
And that's not a very enlightening story either, how I concluded that, but we became friends out of that. And later, that year, actually, in 1984, he, being an unreasonable man as well, had an idea to start a hunger relief operation, which he calls Share Our Strength. And it's become, I think, the largest private hunger relief operation in the country or in the world?
In the country.
In the country. And it's based, this is why I'm referencing, hopefully students have an interest in this, because it's based on an interesting idea, which is rather than just soliciting money, the whole idea is to create something of value and sell something of value. So the first thing he did was he tasted, I think, cities first, and then states, and then now Taste of the Nation. There's one here in New York as well, and one of the ringleaders of that effort is Danny Meyer, who's sitting back here. You can hold your hand up. Danny has the best restaurants in New York City. And Danny's also on SOS board as well. Later, Billy became my chief of staff in the Senate, and when I noticed, I don't remember when I noticed this, in the late 80s, early 90s, wasn't very long after the presidential campaign, that I was noticing that he looked grievously ill. And the reason was he was trying to do 2 things at once. I told him to go do one. And that's I think my single most important contribution to your career is making you do that rather than being chief of staff in the Senate. So what I'd like to start first of all is talk about the early days of SOS. I mean, where did the idea come from? What did you intend to accomplish? And how did you manage to be successful?
Sure. Well, first let me say thank you for having me here. This is really a treat to be attending school, particularly before you leave, because I guess you've only got a few weeks left. But as Bob said, we have known each other a long time, and I've been looking forward to this. It's great to see so many friends.
I mean, you're like alpha and omega of my political career. This is the beginning and you're right at the end.
That's right. I was saying it's great to see so many friends. I was at Tulane University last week. I don't know if you know Scott Cowan, the president there. He invited me down, and the woman who was in charge of the event was very anxious about whether there was going to be a big crowd, and sort of relieved either my anxiety or hers. She said, "Look, we had posters with your picture up all over campus." She said, "You never know." She goes, "Last month we had Blake McCoskey, the man who started Tom's Shoes." She said, "We had a huge crowd." She said, "But he was cute." She's like, "Oh, there's this long kind of awkward pause.
How many people here think Billy's cute?
So, better already. I can relax now. One other thing before I get to your question, Bob, is Bob really did have a lot to do with Share Our Strength in a lot of different ways. But in our very first conversation, where you asked me to be chief of staff, I said I didn't think I could because I was committed to Share Our Strength, and you said. You completely surprised me. You said, "Well, that's not a negative. That's why I want you to be my chief of staff." And until I got previously elevated work for around 4 years. Anyhow, the beginning days of Share Our Strength were not pretty, and then this was kind of I thought, filled with lessons for a lot of organizations that are particularly just starting out. In the 1984 presidential campaign, where Bob and I met. Steve Wozniak, who invented the Apple Macintosh computer, had been on part support. And when I had the idea for Share Our Strength, we were going to contact restaurants, we were going to try and build support around the country. We were going to reach out to a lot of people. And so I thought we better get an Apple Macintosh. They were brand new at the time. And he not only threw in an Apple Macintosh, but he sent us, and it's probably in the Smithsonian today, something called a daisy wheel dot matrix printer. And we thought we were set for life, because this printed out a letter maybe one every 9 or 12 minutes. And we had taken out a $2,000 cash advance on a credit card to start Share Strength. We rented one of those sub-basement offices on Capitol Hill, just a few blocks from where our center office was. And it was one of those offices that you go down a few steps and the window is up by the ceiling. So you only have about this much light. And we had sent out with our Apple Mac and our Daisy Wheel matrix printer, we'd sent out 1,000 letters to chefs and restaurateurs around the country, thinking that they would feel a connection to the issue of hunger since they made their livelihoods from food, and that they would want to be part of Share Strength. And we got not a single response back. And all we could see every day at about 1:15 was that little stripe on the trouser of the mailman's legs as he walked by, and he never stopped. And I went up and confronted him. Said we were going to report him for taking our mail, delivering our mail. Fortunately for him, we sent out another 1,000 letters, and we did get one response, and it was from Alice Waters at Chez Panisse, iconic American chef. She sent $500 with a note saying, let me know what else I can do. And I immediately called her up and I said, I'll tell you what else you can do. You can sign the letters because nobody answers mine. And she did. And we ended up with about 30 chefs and then about 40 chefs. But the idea was, the idea from the very beginning was, could we create an organization that was a nonprofit organization, but more as a tax status than as a management philosophy? Could we be a nonprofit that, rather than redistributing wealth, actually created wealth? That was kind of the core idea we had. We didn't really know what it meant, but we knew that we didn't want to beg for money all the time. We knew that even if we were successful begging for money, there wasn't enough charitable dollars to go around to solve the problem of hunger on the scale that it existed. And so, in fact, we kind of took a radical position, kind of an unreasonable man position, which is that we would have no foundation money, no government money, no direct mail, no high net worth donors, that we would in effect create wealth. We weren't sure how we were going to do that, but to jump ahead, so that you have a chance to ask at least one more question tonight, to jump ahead, we ended up with about 14,000, 15,000 chefs and restaurateurs who were involved in Share Strength. And what we became was, in effect, a market assembler of chefs and restaurateurs, so companies that want to market into the high-end of the restaurant industry sign contracts, marketing contracts with Share Strength, rather than making philanthropic grants to the organization. And so between the $2,000 cash advance and today, we've raised and spent about $300 million, and about 2/3 of it probably comes from different kinds of marketing contracts. American Express wanted to be the exclusive credit card of Share Strength, and for 5 years, Evian wanted to be the exclusive water, and Elite Cafe is the exclusive espresso, and all designed so that they could build relationships with the industry. But it put us in the position of not having to compete with brother and sister organizations for very scarce charitable dollars, and having resources that didn't have strings attached to them, so that we could invest in programs that were not only popular, but that we thought were impactful.
But it also keeps your costs down, and that sort of increases the amount of dollars you're actually able to get out to provide hunger relief.
I think it does. I mean, you have to tend to it, in a different way than you would tend to philanthropic donors. So we have to have account managers who manage all these accounts and make sure that our partners are getting value. But kind of the core idea was that we would actually create wealth rather than redistribute it, and that instead of fighting for our share of the charitable pie, we would make that pie grow.
And what are some of the things you've done to create wealth?
Well, I mean, we think of the cause marketing campaigns. We did a campaign with American Express for 5 years. I see Hans Lind in the back of the room, and Danny Meyer was instrumental in this as well, in which they donated 2 cents to Share Strength every time the American Express card was used. It turned out to be $22.5 million over 4 years. It was good for their business because they advertised that if you used the card, it gave them a competitive advantage over Visa or MasterCard, let's say. We do lots of different cause-related marketing campaigns like that. One of my favorites, also kind of a good lesson here for me, was we did a partnership with Counterfeit cookware. They make pots and pans, and a chef named Mary Sue Milliken from the West Coast introduced me to Dean Kasperzak, who's was the CEO of Counterfeit. He'd actually taken his father's place, and we met, and he told me all about what he was doing. And then at one point he kind of let out a big sigh and he said, but it's just pots and pans. And being the #1 pot and pan salesman in the world was not enough for him. He wanted to do something a little bit more purposeful. So we kind of came up with this idea, he did really, that we would we would take the Share Our Strength trademark on Taste of the Nation, the food wine event that you were talking about, and they would license it, and they would create the Taste of the Nation pan. Their 2-quart sauteed pan would come with Taste of the Nation pan. And I thought, go knock yourself out, that sounds ridiculous to me, right? You would buy that, what does that mean to anybody? But he was a very smart retailer, and he had an idea that we would be contractually obligated to, this is kind of in the creating wealth category, we would be contractually obligated to bring chefs, restaurateurs, others into Bloomingdale's, Macy's, Dillard's, Bon Marché, the big department stores around the country to do cooking demonstrations with this product. We would get $5 for every pan sold, and we would be obligated to bring in this asset that we had created. That kind of our core theory is that most nonprofit organizations, in the course of pursuing their mission, create an asset that has a real marketplace value. And so we would be obligated to bring in these chefs and restaurateurs. Well, they sold 3 times as many of this pan as they'd ever sold before. All the department stores kind of repositioned the pan at the front and center of the store during this 4-week promotion. And the reason I say this, and the insight for me, was they wanted to do a check presentation out of their headquarters in Toledo, Ohio. They had one of those big oversized checks that you feel silly holding for $360,000 to share our strength. And Dean gave a talk to the employees about, thanking them and what they'd accomplished. And then as he was walking off stage with me, he said in a stage whisper, if we're giving you $360,000, can you imagine how much we made? Well, that was the relationship we wanted to have with Dean, because all of the growth in that then came from his end. He realized there was an opportunity to make money in a way that created a partnership for us that, unlike a lot of traditional charitable partnerships, was much more sustainable, much more long-term, much more invested in by both parties.
So are there more or less hungry people on the planet than there were in 1984?
Well, yeah, I hate when people ask that question.
Oh.
And I hope there's
You
not
hate the people that ask the question?
Well, no, because I hope there's not a cause and effect relationship, but there are a lot of hungry people on the planet. Probably this population outstrips our ability to solve the problem. But I think that in many ways we actually, in places, we're solving it in ways that provide kind of proof of concept that you can succeed at it. Certainly here in the United States, where people are hungry for very different reasons, obviously not famine or war or drought, but really economic issues. We found some ways here, I think, to dramatically increase the resources that go to people who are living in poverty so that they can actually not just line up at a soup kitchen for food, but be part of public programs like school lunch, school breakfast.
Right, I mean, I asked the question because my presumption is, both for that reason and perhaps others, economic, there must have been moments during the last 26 years at Share Our Strength where there were significant disappointments, setbacks, problems that seemed insurmountable at the time.
Well, there were. I mean, there were certainly, like any organization that is constrained, resource constrained against the size of the problem. There were disappointments that we couldn't be as impactful as we wanted to be, that we couldn't reach as many people as needed our services. There were, in the early days, the frustrations of not being well known.
What are your services? How do you distribute the money to you?
So we do 2 things now, Bob. We make grants to probably 250 organizations around the country. Also, about 15% of our funds go overseas, but most of our funding is in the United States, split between emergency food assistance, maternal and child health clinics that deal with malnutrition, advocacy efforts to change public policy. But the huge opportunity that we've only come to understand in the last couple of years, and the thing that I think has kind of turbocharged Share Our Strength, because our growth has been enormous in the last 24 months, has been understanding, why are kids in this country hungry? We obviously don't lack food. We don't even lack food and nutrition programs, as you know from your time in the Senate. We had great programs with bipartisan support: school lunch, school breakfast, summer feeding, food stamps, now called SNAP. So we asked ourselves, why are so many kids hungry? And what we realized is kids are not accessing these programs. So I was in Louisiana last week with Mayor Mitch Landrieu and Mayor of New Orleans. In New Orleans, they have 32,000 kids who get a free and reduced price school lunch. Here in New York, we have 1.1 million. In New Orleans, it's 32,000. Of those 32,000, although all 32,000 are eligible for breakfast, only 16,000 get it. And in the summer, only 2,000 get it. Those percentages are almost identical in New York City, almost identical. And so what you have are all these logistical hurdles.
So 1,200,000 eligible and 600,000 not getting it, you would expect in New York. Half?
Well,
Half?
yeah, no, it'd be, so 40% would get school breakfast here instead of the 1.1 million. So I'll tell you what's really going on here. I went out to talk to Governor Ritter from Colorado. We had this very interesting conversation. All the governors, of course, are forced to cut their budgets at a time like this. They're all struggling. You were governor, you know what this is like. And you can probably picture this conversation I had with Ritter. I went into his office. This was about 9 months ago. And he was standing there in his shirt sleeves. They were in the middle of this budget process. He was, had all these legal pads in front of him, trying to figure out what to do. And I went to sit down, and he said, look, before you even sit down, let me just tell you something. I've got no money for anything. Okay? We didn't know each other very well. We made some small talk. We had a couple of mutual friends. But he said, look, I don't have any money. He says, as a matter of fact, he says, just 3 hours ago this morning, Lance Armstrong was sitting where you're sitting, and he wanted $100,000 for an AIDS ride, and I didn't have it. And then he looked in at me like, and you're not Lance Armstrong. It's like, okay, I got it. But what I said to him, respectfully, I said, what I'm really here to say is not so much to ask for money or to complain, but to say that Colorado ranks 43rd lowest out of 49 states in the percentage of kids eligible for school breakfast are getting it. 45th lowest for summer feeding, 49th lowest for food stamps. So what that means...
And this is all federal money.
It's all federal money. So what that means is you've left, by the most conservative estimate, $71 million on the table in Washington. Authorized and appropriated years ago. This is a kind of a 5-year cycle for these authorizations. And so as governors are starting to realize this, you know, with bipartisan support, by the way, this is not a healthcare battle, this is not a state tax issue. This is Democrats and Republicans who have said for more than 30 years there should be school lunch, there should be school breakfast. So we find jurisdictions who are, in effect, sending this money back. And when you ask why, you know, Governor Ritter kind of looked around to his staff and he said, is what he's saying true? And they said, yes. And he said, well, how can this be? And I said, well, you know, I said, if it was a defense contract for $71 million that had been allocated and earmarked for the state, somebody would have been in here a long time ago. And that really kind of gets also to the point of this book, which is that, you know, the people we work with are really voiceless politically. They have no lobbyists.
Well, I mean, I find it quite interesting to talk about it. Let's segue into the book. What you describe in the book is this unusual set of bedfellows, people with a lot of power and people without power working together, yes, on malaria
yes,
case.
I think that's sure.
And that's what you're doing in a way.
Well, I think so. I mean, to me, the toughest problems to solve anywhere, and you should jump in on this from your perspective, especially as governor and as a senator. To me, the toughest problems to solve are those problems that affect people who are so voiceless, so economically marginalized that there are no markets for solving them. So there's no economic market for feeding hungry kids. If there was an economic market for doing what we do at Sheriff's Training, some big company, Sodexo or Marriott or Walmart, somebody would be in there doing it.
And no PAC contributions.
That's right. There's no PAC contribution. So there's also not much of a political market.
Actually, it could be the opposite of the political market. You actually get forces working against it.
That's right. That's right. And so the reason that most nonprofit organizations exist, the reason most NGOs exist, is to fill that market gap. But it's very hard to do without market forces. And actually, the Share Our Strength experience led almost directly to this book, but in a long delayed way, and for reasons I'll describe, because two of my friends, Linda and Neil Stromeyer, I know I couldn't talk about this for about 8 years, but the Ethiopian famine was the catalyst for starting Share Our Strength in 1984. And we've gone back a number of times after that at the onsets of different famines. And one of the...
you went there.
I didn't go there in 84, but I went there in 2000, again in 2002, when they had their, what was kind of the next comparable worst famine. And devastating set of circumstances. We went with a colleague of yours, former Senator Harris Wofford from Pennsylvania, and a delegation of folks. And while we were there, we stopped at this terrific school that we were helping to build, and we were helping to build a hospital next door to it. And for one of these random reasons, I connected with this 13-year-old girl, probably because she was the same age as my daughter at the time, named Alima Dari. And we ended up talking. She called me over. She spoke beautiful English. She was just this, you know, vibrant, young, incredible woman. We stayed in touch for about 1.5 years, and we sent each other letters, and she sent me pictures of her graduation from middle school. And then when Chuck Schofield, who you know, went over about 1 year later on a trip that I couldn't go on, I gave him a letter to give to Olima, and I talked to Chuck every day, wherever we are in the world, and 3 times a day. I had been talking to him for a day, 2 days, 6 days, 8 days. Finally, I got an email from him. The email said, I hate like how to tell you this, but Olima died of cerebral malaria. It had been misdiagnosed. And I was...
Which I believe is most lethal.
Which is the most lethal form of malaria. And so I always think of something, Dr. Martin Luther King once said that in this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. The tide in the affairs of men does not remain in flood. It ebbs, and the moving finger writes, and having been writ moves on. So this notion of there's such a thing as being too late, we were too late for Olima. We were actually building a hospital next door to the school. You'd be able to...
Besides the problem, in the book you say, I believe, there are more doctors from Ethiopia in the United States than there are Ethiopian doctors in Ethiopia.
Easy. There's more doctors in Chicago, more Ethiopian doctors in Chicago than there are in Ethiopia. And there's just a huge expat community. It's a very difficult place to live and work. We've had, I think, the privilege of identifying a number of Ethiopian organizations, indigenous young men and women who got their education and came back that we've been funding. But when you think of the toll of, you don't have to go to Ethiopia to meet your Olima. There's kids in this country, there's kids in Haiti where you and I were just a few months ago, there's kids in Denver and DC who are basically Olimas, who are voiceless. And when you total it up, malaria, which is a preventable and a curable disease, kills about 1 million of these kids a year, all under 5, almost all in Africa and Asia.
So on this book, surprisingly, you open it up with a story about an artist, Brother Thomas.
Yeah.
Tell us about Brother Thomas.
Well, I was struggling to figure out how to write this book, as my editor Clive knows better than anybody. I had written a lot about this man named Steve Hoffman, who I know we'll talk about in a moment, who's developing a malaria vaccine. But I got invited to give up what for me was an odd kind of talk at an art gallery in Boston, where they do this event for the community, and they invite a lot of nonprofit organizations. And I was supposed to give a talk on the connection between Brother Thomas's spirituality and social justice, and I really struggled with it. And I went to study his pots, which they have. They're the exclusive representative of. And I met the gallery owner who gave me kind of a tutorial on Brother Thomas. One of the things he told me, and it's not entirely unusual in that part of the art world, is that Brother Thomas, of the first 1,200 pots he made, he destroyed 1,100 of them, and he kept that ratio his entire life. And it just, I started to think about that ethic of what it means when good is not good enough for you, and how most of the achievements that most of us would find inspiring or important in our lives, usually in the DNA of those achievements, there's a gene encoded: good is not good enough. Somebody who decided, no, it's got to be better. No, it's not acceptable that 1 million kids die a year. No, it's not acceptable that only 16,000 of the 33,000 kids in New Orleans get their school breakfast. This notion that good is not good enough, I found, actually ends up driving a lot of the people that I ended up writing about, and it helped me kind of frame the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the first, it won't be the last time I read something. I feel like I'm revealing my ignorance in the process of learning something. I feel like I should have known ahead of time. But my guess is if you ask, let's say, 100 people at random, is there a vaccine for malaria, you'd get a significant fraction who would say there must be.
You'd get a majority who would say there must be. This has actually come up a few times. It's interesting that you asked that. And I've actually had a few people email me and say, isn't there a vaccine for malaria? There's actually never been a vaccine for any parasitic disease, not for malaria or any parasitic disease. This particular disease is so complicated. If you compare it to the HIV virus, for example, which we know is complex, I think the HIV virus is made up of between 9 and 13 genes. It's in that range. The single-celled malaria parasite, single-celled organism has 5,300 genes. And if any of those genes mutate, it becomes resistant to the drug. So when I went to Ethiopia, I took a course of mefloquine that cost me $350, which is, twice the annual income of, the average Ethiopian. But I took a course of mefloquine. which today I don't think would even be available because they've invented new drugs that are less resistant. The parasite constantly adapts. There's been a lot of focus on insecticide-treated bed nets, and there's been a lot of support for getting bed nets to families. And one of the things that
you set the stage for this thing because malaria is not as lethal for adults as it is for kids. So what's the casualty rate on the planet for malaria?
Well, 300 million to 500 million people get malaria a year. I should say there's 300 to 500 million cases of malaria because some people get it more than once. If you survive past the age of 5, you'll likely be protected in terms of fatalities. You'll still get sick with it, but it won't kill you. But if you're under the age of 5, it can be very, very fatal. And about between 800,000, it's actually down to about 850,000 this year from what's been 1 million for many of the last few years actually died from malaria.
And where are the deaths distributed? Is it mostly in Africa?
Very heavily in Africa and parts of Asia, parts of Thailand and Cambodia, where you and I also traveled to other places like that, but very heavily African.
Okay, so you start to look at malaria, and when did you discover Steve Hoffman?
Well, I started to ask people in the field who was doing interesting work on global health issues, and then I kind of zoomed in on malaria. And I had a couple of people, including one who I quote in this book, very prominent researcher at Johns Hopkins University, head of their chemistry department, a woman who's chair of the chemistry department, Diane Griffin, who told me what was going on in the field. And then at the end of our time together, just as she's getting up out of her chair, she says, and then there's that crazy damn thing Steve Hoffman's doing. And she kind of laughs. And so, just like you would have, right? I was like, let's go meet Steve Hoffman. This is my instinct from working for Bob for 8 years. I was like, let's go meet Steve Hoffman. And I'll tell you why she thought it was crazy and why a lot of people in the field kind of ridicule it. There's 2 docs just a little ways from here at NYU's Medical Center, I think the Langone Center on 3rd Street, named Ruth and Victor Nussensweig. They're in their 80s and they still share a lab today. But in 1967, they discovered something that they thought could point the way towards a vaccine for malaria. They just discovered an immunogen, something that would trigger your immune system. And what they found is that if you take the mosquito that's infected with the parasite, and you radiate it to weaken it, and then you extract the mosquito from where, if you extract the parasite from where it lives in the mosquito, which is in its salivary glands, and you can do that in a way that's clean and pure and shelf-stable. If you take that, you don't mix it with anything. That is the vaccine. If I inject all of those parasites into you after they've been weakened,
it's an unpleasant thought.
It's an unpleasant thought, but you'd be protected to the level of about 90 to 95%.
It takes some persuading to talk me into that.
That's right. And there's never been a vaccine that's been more than 35% effective. And so Ruth and Victor Nussensweig wrote this paper, it got a lot of attention, but they said, but of course, it's entirely impractical, if not impossible, to make a vaccine based on dissecting the mosquito's salivary glands. So obviously, if you think mosquito, you think salivary gland, right? So what people envision with Steve Hoffman is that he's got a room full of people in white lab coats bent over their desks dissecting mosquito salivary glands. So I went to visit him. Guess what I found? A room full of people bent over their desks. He decided that maybe impractical is preferable to 1 million kids a year dying. So what if it's impractical? And the first thing he told me, which I see so many parallels to so many of the social issues that I think many of us in this room care about. The first thing he said to me on the day I met him was that the solution to a malaria vaccine is not scientific discovery, it's biotech engineering, which is to say we know something that works, and we have to figure out a way to scale it up and do it affordable and deliver it to people. So you could say about what we do at Share Our Strength, what Wendy Kopp does at Teach for America, what Jeffrey Canada does at Harlem Children's Zone. You could say great ideas, but very expensive, very hard to deliver, very unrealistic, very impractical, unreasonable. You could say that about all those. But in fact, that's different from we don't know what the solution is. And so in this case, we do know what the solution is. We've got to figure out how to get it into people. And that's what Steve Hoffman is doing. When I met him, he was in
How many mosquitoes, talking about how many mosquitoes do they have to dissect I mean, what's the content of a salivary gland of a mosquito?
Well,
pretty small amount, right?
there were some big surprises there.
Oh, really?
Yes, most.
Could have been that big.
Now listen to this. The day I walked into Steve Hoffman's office, he was on the phone with the Gates Foundation. When I met him, he was in a little strip mall in Silver Spring, about 20 minutes from where I live. And he was there was like a photo framing store, and a Hallmark card store, and this and that. And then there's this one unmarked door, didn't even have the name of his biotech company, through which you walk into a biohazard level 3 lab where he's creating more, he's actually breeding the mosquitoes and the parasites. And so I'm on the phone with him. His office, by the way, unlike most CEOs who are in the back of the building far off, his was right by the door, because if the mosquitoes get out, you know, Steve's the first one out the door. And it was kind of a strange place, because there's bug zappers everywhere, and there's literally fly swatters, which you think, in this day and age, we can do better than everybody's got a little swatter by their place. So it's, you know, it's kind of a strange place. But as I walk into his office, I'm waiting for him, and there's a little, and it was just bare bones, you know, had no money, but he's literally on the phone with the Gates Foundation. I don't know this, but I can hear him over the transom, and he's yelling, 350,000. He says, I'm telling you, 350,000. And I don't know what he's talking about. Then I realized that's how many parasites they extracted from one mosquito. So the conventional wisdom was, which tells you how many doses of a vaccine you can create. And the conventional wisdom was that you could get 8,000 or 10,000, you know, parasites from a mosquito. I said, Steve, how do you get $350,000? And as if this were a made for New York conversation, he said, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. They've been doing this. I mean, they really, you know, they're kind of state of the art. So they actually think that they've got kind of an algorithm that if you had, you know, 8 technicians working 8 hours a day and, you know, doing this, you could actually create the dosages to do this.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the economics of this, because I don't know if you saw last week in the news a story about a not-for-profit pharmaceutical company called PATH. Do you know them? Do you know PATH?
I do know PATH, yeah.
And they discovered a vaccine for spinal meningitis, but the cost per dose they got down to, I think, 50 cents, up against normal vaccine in the United States is $140 or $150. But even at 50 cents, they're worried about whether or not they can get the money to get the vaccines into the field to deliver the medicine. So we first start off with inside of our healthcare system. If you know, they're looking for the pharmaceutical companies, the for-profit pharmaceutical companies, understandably, are looking for things that generate profit. Meaning they got to have relatively large volume, but they have to have a large volume of people willing to pay whatever price they're charging for their medicine. And they're doing research on very expensive things. They usually cost $1,000, $5,000 a dose, and big numbers for the dosage. So, do you see that as in the instance of malaria, a problem that I mean, this lack of economic demand? The demand is there, but it's non-economic demand. People really can't afford to pay it.
No, I think that's exactly the problem. I think it goes back to our earlier discussion about the lack of markets, you know, for these types of things. There have been some creative efforts to address this particular issue. So, for example, the Gates Foundation and President Clinton's foundation have been working on something called advanced market commitments. And the idea is that you would get countries to agree so that GlaxoSmithKline, which is one of the big players in malaria vaccine development, you would get countries to agree that if, in fact, they come up with a vaccine that get through clinical trials, we will buy, and these are mostly, you know, Western and developed countries, we will buy X million worth, so that at least the vaccine developer knows, and these are kind of contractual, these advanced market commitments, that there will be a market for it. That's not the same as a market where the people who are impacted, the victims of the disease, can pay for it. But at least you know as a developer that there will be some level of financial compensation.
Right, but even in this case, I think Gates put 40 or 50 million bucks into the sufferer of meningitis. Even they get down to the end and say we can't afford to buy even at 50 cents a dose. We can't afford to buy that and give it out. So it's basically the case there is for a taxpayer-funded program of some kind to provide the assistance. Is it not?
No, I think that's right. I think ultimately, again, on the scale that you're talking, 300 to 500 million cases in Africa, if you were really trying to wipe out malaria, you'd have to have significant public support of that kind. Yeah.
And it seems to me what your book, the case your book is making is That it's not a question of how to do it. The question is, do we have the resources? Are we willing to put the money into, save 1 million lives a year?
Yeah, I think that, well, I think that's right, but also I think, the economic point you're making is one that I think gets lost on a lot of people, partly in global health, certainly in the nonprofit sector, this idea that you need to build the economics in from the beginning. So one of the other doctors that I write about in this book is trying to develop a vaccine for hookworm, which affects 750 million kids a year. It's not fatal, but it's very debilitating. And when I met him, he said, if I can't do it for $1 a dose, I might as well not do it. And in fact, there are some vaccines for hookworm that are fairly far along, but they're so expensive that he hasn't even spent a second on those. Because, again, if you can't do it for $1 a dose, 50 cents a dose, whatever, there's no sense doing it. And I think in the nonprofit sector, again, the analogy that I saw is we tend to build great programs that we think are model programs that are kind of gold-plated, and then we back into the economics afterwards, and we realize, our program's not reaching that many people.
I mean, to your Voiceless operation, I don't want to slip yourself with politics too rapidly, but I say it's impossible not to go down any slippery slope anything other than rapidly. The president, in order to get a few moderate Republicans, such as they are, to support the START Treaty, ratification of the START Treaty, agreed to $80 billion over 10 of nuclear weapons modernization. He said, well, wait a minute, isn't the START Treaty, the whole idea is to get rid of nuclear weapons, and why are we not putting it? But it was a political thing, because there's a voice advocating for, and there's a number of highly influential organizations, largely supportive of military strategies one time or the other, plus the laboratories themselves, which is very important. So there's a voice that's arguing for that. It isn't just John Kyle on his own waking up one morning and saying that nuclear weapons need to be modernized. So what kind of strategies have you developed over you mentioned that SOS has been turbocharged the last 24 months because governors are waking up to the fact that they've got the capacity to increase the number of children who get fed, and there's no cost to them. What other political strategies would you recommend? Have you seen that work? Because you're not going to change the situation where the voiceless have a voice. The question is whether or not people with a voice are going to be a voice that seems to speak to those who don't have it.
I think that's right. I think you have to first try to create more political will than exists, because you can't out-fundraise these problems. So you've got to create the political will, but you've also got to create, as you say, the confidence, I think, among policymakers that there are programs that work. I mean, so much of, in kind of the anti-poverty and the anti-hunger community, so much of what we do has been stigmatized kind of as, wasteful or failure or big government or, helping people who are lazy. And when you strip away everything and if you just hone in on the programs that work, I think you can make a very compelling case to policymakers of all political stripes that this makes sense, that there's a great return on investment on it, that it's a good economic stimulus. So you have to, I think you have to move from making kind of the, the emotional and the moral argument, which I'm not suggesting you don't make, because I think that's part of it, but also make the practical argument. And when people see things that work, I think there's this wide perception. Like I've got 2 grown kids who are, they're 25 and 20, and when they come out of the subway in Washington, there's a homeless person asking them for money, and they think, Dad, you still haven't figured it out. You've been at this for a long time. You haven't solved this problem. People don't think there's solutions to these problems, but my experience has been exactly the opposite, which is we do have solutions. We may not know how to scale them up. We may not know how to sustain them, but that's what I think kind of the new generation of social entrepreneurs is all about.
Are people in the social entrepreneur movement providing assistance in the developing world to get governance improved, improve the quality of governance? I mean, it does seem to me that civil society in particular plays a very useful role in the United States in between the government and the private sector. I'm curious as to whether or not you see that happening. And when we went to Haiti,
yes, that's what I was thinking.
The big problem in Haiti is, if you say the government leadership, again, such as it is, you've got enough income, as impoverished as you are, you got enough income, you ought to at least be able to have good roads, storm sewers, and wastewater treatment. They aren't doing the fundamentals.
No, that's right. Well, when we went to Haiti, I thought it was fascinating because we did a lot of things that Senator Kerrey, traveling with us, made possible, including meeting with a lot of the government officials, particularly around health. And there were a lot of NGOs at this meeting that we were at. almost all of them seem to have an acrimonious adversarial relationship with the government, and probably for good reason, because the government is not much of a government. But there was one organization there that is pretty well known, Partners in Health, led by Paul Farmer, who's been able to get things done. They figured out how to work with the government, and I think NGOs have to do that. When we open this up, I'll put Catherine Pacey on the spot. Catherine's the chief of staff to Jacqueline Novogratz at the Acumen Fund, and they work overseas in a very entrepreneurial way, helping to fund for-profits. Well, we've just opened it up.
Yeah,
so I was just trying to give you a couple seconds, but they basically fund for-profits that are having a social impact that might not find market investments otherwise. So,
well, while they're running a microphone down here, let me just one more question about in the book. It's also a very interesting story that you told about the negative impact of the selling of drugs, pharmaceuticals that are not either counterfeit drugs that are not sufficiently potent to actually kill the parasite, or that have some other flaw. Just describe it, because I wouldn't have thought of that as a powerful negative.
I wouldn't have either, but there's a huge market for counterfeit drugs, including counterfeit anti-malarials, and they tend to include some ingredients of anti-malarials, but you know, the way the counterfeiters make their profit is they only include a very small percentage of the active ingredient, and the rest is just fluff. And as a result, people take them, and they become even more resistant to drugs in the future, so that not only do people get sick from taking them because they don't have the protection, but then it also creates this dynamic where the next batch of the next strain of malaria is resistant because it doesn't, you know, like combination therapies, it doesn't include the combination. But it's a huge black market, and there's a lot that governments are trying to do to combat it.
So one last thing, and then you can jump in. Because I mentioned earlier, and I wanted you to comment on how the anti-malarial effort has brought together some strange bedfellows and the Voiceless and the powerful. And you had some very interesting comments of statistics that were used by the carpet during the Second World War.
Oh yeah, well the strange bedfellows are the military has driven so much of our work on malaria and other neglected tropical diseases, but the single biggest factor taking Americans out of battle in almost every war we've been in has been malaria. It has not been enemy combatants or bullets. And I forget the exact language that MacArthur used, but he talked about how many divisions he was planning to lose as a result of malaria if we didn't come up with a vaccine. So we continue to see this almost wherever our troops are deployed. So the Walter Reed Medical Center, the Bethesda Naval Medical Center, before the Gates Foundation existed, before PATH, which you referred to, before this kind of philanthropic community took root in global health, all of this was driven by the U.S. military. In fact, Steve Hoffman, who's at the center of this book, was an anti-war protester who shaved his beard, cut his hair, and decided if he was going to do something about malaria, he had to go into the military because that's where the labs were, that's where the facilities were, and they've been, they've had an enormous impact on this.
So Acumen Fund is a nonprofit venture capital fund, so we're investing in companies that are finding ways to deliver healthcare, housing, water, and energy to the poor in ways they can afford. And when we started to make investments, we never expected government would play a role. We were very intentionally looking at the private sector as providing the kinds of solutions that would work. But we're starting to see government play a role in unexpected ways in scaling our companies. So when we invested in ambulances in India, we invested in a company with 10 ambulances that was using a cross-subsidy model to deliver ambulance service to the poor, where if you went to a free or government hospital, you paid no fare. If you went to an expensive private hospital, you paid full fare, and they now have 100 ambulances. The government of India now sees that as a way to deliver ambulance services across the country, and they're investing to scale it to 1,250 ambulances in the next 2 years. So public resources coming in to scale our private innovation, and we're seeing that in a lot of cases in India, Pakistan, and Kenya, where we work.
Can you give some examples?
So ambulances, we won. Toilets in Kenya, we invested in a private toilet company that's delivering safe sanitation in Kenya, where half the population lacks access to clean, safe toilets. So this private
A to Z on this topic, right?
Exactly. Malaria Vet Nets, where we found a private sector Tanzanian entrepreneur who was a textile manufacturer and did a technology transfer from Sumitomo Chemical in Japan to start manufacturing nets in Africa. So you had an African solution to an African problem, but using public resources to get those products out to the poor.
And how big's your fund?
We have about $50 million under management in about 50 companies globally now.
And
So
how many people-
this is where you get to the question of scale. Relative to official foreign assistance, we're tiny, we're a drop in the bucket. So how do you take what we're doing
You're
and
tiny against normal private equity funds as well, right? I mean, $50 million is a relatively small fund.
right? But how do you take the concept now and scale it, because we're showing that it works at
How long have you been doing it?
9 years.
This is a perfect question, because the person starts off by saying, "My grantee organization of SOS, the New York City Coalition Against Hunger. We couldn't do what we do without your support, so don't stop."
Where are
What about the Obama administration announcement that they're going to end childhood hunger by 2015? Is that doable, realistic? Especially given the tax agreement last night, is it realistic?
Yeah, it's going to be hard. I mean, we've all had this common goal, share our strength to set this goal of ending hunger by a time certain. We had said 2020, and something got lost in translation on the way to the Obama campaign at the time. The president came back and said 2015. So that will be hard to meet, but they have played a very important role. The child nutrition reauthorization legislation just passed a few days ago, finally in the House. It had passed the Senate before. The administration had pushed for it. Somebody who you probably know well, Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, is a really good man who really cares about these issues. So they've done a lot. They've set the bar higher now. That legislation added $4.5 billion to programs
Over how many years?
For kids over the next 5 years.
And what are the elements of that? How does that money get spent?
It increases funding for school meals so that you can actually have healthier meals. It increases outreach so more kids can get enrolled in these programs. Something you would find interesting, though, about the politics of this bond.
I remember, but I had a healthy meal when I went to school.
Yeah, they're hard to come by.
Yeah.
But when we first proposed this idea of going from being an organization that feeds people to being an organization that ends hunger, the politics of this were so interesting because we called together about 50 or 60 organizations that we worked very closely with. And this was about 4 years ago. We said, here's our big idea. We think we could actually put a stake in the ground and say we're going to end childhood hunger by a time certain, 2015. Everybody in the room was against it. These are organizations that we fund, so they could at least have acted like they were for it, even if they were against it. But they were all against it. And what we realized was there was this in the nonprofit world. There was almost this cultural discomfort with accountability. I mean, what people said was, how would we measure? How would we know? What if we missed? But there was really this discomfort with, we're going to be held accountable to that particular outcome. And then when we met with business partners, they were the mirror image opposite. They all said some version of, you're telling me you know where the goal is, and you know how far you are from the goal line, and you know what it takes to get across. We want to be part of that. We love that. So, I mean, eventually people came around, but it was it's almost like eradicating malaria. For years and years, people had talked about, we need to treat people with malaria, we need to provide medicines for malaria.
Is there an active association now of organizations, again, because this increases the size of the voice. If you get businesses working for not-for-profits on the goal to end childhood hunger, is there?
There are a lot of our corporate partners have signed up as I think really significant voices on this. They range from companies like ConAgra, who are in the food business and are based in Nebraska, to a lot of others, and now governors, and now other policymakers and the administration. So I think we're gonna get there. Whether we get there by 2015, I'm not sure, but I think the infrastructure exists here. It's almost kind of pathetically lame to say we couldn't get these kids enrolled.
Is SOS a driving force in this effort?
I think I would say we are a driving force.
A or D?
Well, I would say D, but you're impressed.
Danny left, so you're going to ask him. What would you advise somebody that has an interest in getting involved in the future or today in social entrepreneurship?
Well, I mean, to me, the key is always to, first find whatever it is that you're most passionate about and drive straight towards it. But also this notion of, and this lesson that we learned, and I think it has to be, I mentioned this growth of share our strengths since we set this goal of ending childhood hunger. We, in an economy that has been very difficult and that most nonprofits have found themselves very challenged in, we've had 40% revenue growth in the last 12 months. We've added 30 staff. We'll add 40 more. So if there's anybody in the room looking for a job who cares about this issue, you should come talk to us. We've grown enormously, and I think it's because we were willing to kind of put the stake in the ground. So I think this notion of, really thinking about this kind of leap of imagination, how do you, maybe people didn't think it was possible to actually end hunger or end malaria, but can you do that? I think inspires a lot of support and steers it your way.
But do you provide any kind of assistance or advice or support for people that are trying to start their own nonprofits in this area?
Well, we do through, we have a subsidiary called Community Wealth Ventures, which is it's basically a consulting firm, and it focuses a lot on what we had talked about earlier, which is how nonprofits can leverage their assets into real revenue generation, but also helps nonprofits on a wide range of issues, or individuals who are thinking of getting involved.
Give me some ideas of suggestions you've made that have worked for individuals who, not-for-profits that generate wealth.
Well, I'll tell you a good one. A Jewish Social Services Agency in Rockville, Maryland provides home health care to their mission is to serve low-income families. So they provide home health care to people who need to be served in their homes. Such quality health care that when we looked at it, we said, why wouldn't you provide that to high net worth families in Bethesda, Chevy Chase area, which is your kind of neighborhood? And they said, well, our mission is low-income families. And we said, well, how do you fund your mission? They said, well, we struggle. We do rubber chicken dinners, and we call people constantly and beg them for money. And we said, well, why don't you, that's not your mission either, right? Your mission is serving low-income people. It's not trying to get people to come to a dinner they don't want to come to. So how about you start to serve high-income families? And they did. They created a business. In fact, they now have about $2 million in revenues, about $400,000 of which is profit, all of which goes to extending the reach of what they can do. So we've helped a lot of organizations understand that.
But they're still a not-for-profit.
They're still a not-for-profit. That's right. And in Share Our Strengths case, our asset was kind of understanding this, and we created Community Wealth Ventures as a for-profit that we own. There's no reason that nonprofits can't own for-profits. You could own anything from a gas station to a Dunkin' Donuts franchise instead of Macy's or Bloomingdale's if you wanted to. Most of them don't want to, which is part of the problem.
Well, except there's a bit of an issue there as well. In some cases, the not-for-profit community is not providing that kind of really ancillary service, even though they're set up in a tax-exempt status to do it. Now, it's true in the hospital arena. There's been a number of pretty good, careful examinations of whether or not their charitable contributions is at the level they want, and then they start getting into other businesses.
Right.
And get distracted by those businesses. So is there a risk?
There's a risk of distraction. There's a risk of, I think if it's what we're talking about and what we focus on in Community Wealth Ventures, we see as a means to an end, not an end in itself. Sometimes the risk is that it will become the end in itself. But to me, that's about organizational leadership and about, really focusing on what's most important to you. So to me, the question is not, should organizations do it or not? There's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it.
Among the online list of things that I've learned since coming to this school is how what appears to be uniquely generous Americans are, both with money and time. And I haven't tested that proposition, but I see individuals wanting to contribute a substantial amounts of either net worth or income, as well as a substantial amount of time on a voluntary basis. And I don't see that being repeated at the level that exists in the United States. But maybe it is. Is the United States unique that way?
Well, the United States is definitely a leader that way. One of the interesting kind of sub-statistics is that lower income people donate a much higher percentage of their income philanthropically than high income, high net worth people do. But no, I think the United States is a leader in that way. We try to get people to think to match their generosity with being strategic, because the risk is always that people are going to want to fund things that give them almost kind of an immediate good and warm feeling, and sometimes that's not the most strategic way to go.
I think one of the reasons that farmers have been so successful is he's a long-term, in Haiti, right, a long-term player. He's there for the duration. This is not, I think, go down for a year or two and try to get some immediate gratification and leave.
Right. Now you have to be willing to build an infrastructure. Again, if you've got a good idea, if you've got a good product or service, you build a better mousetrap, then to me you almost have a moral obligation to invest in yourself you know, in the nonprofit sector, all the pressure is to put resources externally. And so we kind of hollow out our organizations. Everybody involved in a nonprofit is so committed to creating social value everywhere, all the time, that they basically exploit the nonprofit. So the most common question that we get is, you know, none of this donation is going to go to pay for salaries, is it? Well, or for administrative expenses. And you mean like our accountant who keeps track of the books to make sure the money's spent the right way, or the staff will actually do this? So, you know, I think people have who aren't in the field have kind of a narrow sense of what's most impactful.
But do you think that, do you think that young people today in their 20s, let's say, have a greater or less interest in volunteering and getting involved in projects that are, you know, basically trying to just do good and make the world better?
Boy, I think greater. I think there's a lot of young people in business schools and schools of public health, schools of education, schools of government and public service who really want to be in the community sector. You know, if you look at kind of the broad chunk of history, when you think about what happened after people got disillusioned from Vietnam and Watergate and things like that, that's where, you know, there's people today like, you know, again, like a Wendy Kopp, a Teacher America, and Alan Casey who started City Year, or Jeffrey Candidate, who in the 1960s, you have to believe they would have been in, you know, Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department. But their reflex was not to go into government. Their reflex was to do something in the private, nonprofit space. I think a lot of them will come back to, you know, ultimately, as Wendy Kopp has, for example, seeing the importance of public policy.
After reading Legacy of Nations, I think they're more likely to have been in his campaign than his Justice Department.
Yeah.
Well, but what's the support that's being provided for young people who are trying to figure out what to do and how to get involved?
Well, I think there's a lot.
Are colleges doing all that they need to do?
A lot of schools are actually creating curriculums around this now. So there are actually courses on social entrepreneurship. There are a whole set of organizations. Net Impact works in with business schools to create opportunities.
Who's doing it well?
To do this. Oh boy. I think a lot of folks are. I mean, when I was down at Tulane, I was very impressed. They really want Tulane to become the reference brand in the university space for community service. And so they have a very robust program of engaging people in services. You can't go through Tulane without you know, doing that in a significant way. But I think you know, a lot of schools are. Boston College does, Notre Dame does. I think a lot of schools do.
This is another question about this. It says Tracy Kidder. I think Tracy Kidder says there are 12,000 NGOs in Haiti. Is that true? What does it mean to the value of NGOs in Haiti to help fix the problem?
Yeah, well, it's hard to fathom. Again, when you and I were there, we saw a lot of NGOs, and we heard a lot about. We heard about a lot more, and we know that literally billions and billions of dollars. Even if you leave aside the many billions of dollars that were pledged and never made it to Haiti, there were still billions of dollars that did make it there, and it's very hard to see the kind of impact they're having. We saw it in some small places. We went to some clinics that, you know, were obviously making a huge difference in people's lives, but the scale of the problem with 1.3 million people living in 10 cities tells you that things are not really happening fast there.
Do you think that if malaria was in Europe or Russia or China or the United States, in other words, it's in non-tropical environments, that we'd be dealing with this?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't the United States. I mean, the Center for Disease Control was set up for one reason in 1946, malaria. That was the entire rationale for creating the Center for Disease Control. We had quite a bit of it in this country. We used DDT to get rid of it until we decided that DDT was bad. Now other countries are asking why can't they be using DDT and other types of insecticides. But no, it used to be a significant issue here.
But the presumption of the question is the wealthier you are, I think the easier time it is. In other words, it's saying, is Africa doomed? Because its presumption is it's less valuable than the Western world.
Well, I think the Western world will have to help Africa on this, like we were talking about in terms of public dollars. There's lots of issues with African governments and their public health structures. I think one of the biggest concerns, you started to get into this a little bit earlier, is if we actually do come up with a vaccine that gets through clinical trials and we know it's extremely effective, how would you distribute it to so many Africans where there's not necessarily refrigeration, there's not electricity, there's not the roads. These are significant problems that Africa's ultimately probably going to have to solve for itself.
And that struck, and again, off your book, I was reading it, I kept thinking about all the unreasonable people that are making an effort where there may not be success at the other end of it. In other words, they determined to go down a course, they're anonymous, and maybe they fail every single day and fail in the end to be successful.
Well, with this issue in particular, it's been such a roller coaster, and anybody who goes into this field knows that the odds are 99% likely that they will fail. So one of the things I do with this book, at the beginning of each chapter, I have a press clip. So I think in one of the first chapters, there's a press clipping from the New York Times. I think maybe it might have been the front page of the New York Times in 1964.
There's another one you had 66.
One from 66 that basically says, researchers report today that we'll be able to end malaria in the next 6 to 12 months. They've come up with something that they're sure is going to work. And so you've seen this over and over and over again. But it's very formidable. And the people who go into it are, interestingly enough, the top 4 researchers in the country: Ruth and Victor Nussensweig, Steve Hoffman and his wife, a man named Pedro Lanza and his wife Clara. They're all married couples. They're all scientists who married each other because I think this work is so lonely and so difficult that you do go through a period. And Steve Hoffman himself is kind of a complicated guy. He's this combination of really brilliant, charming when he wants to be, arrogant at times, ruthlessly competitive, all the things he had to be to sustain himself when nobody else believed in him. And when I think of Victor and Ruth Nussensweig in their lab over on Langone Street, they're in their 80s now. I went to meet her recently. I'd met her once before, but I went to talk to her as I was finishing up this book. Here's this woman who's seen her idea go through this whole trajectory, and she was sitting there with another woman. When I walked into the lab, they were like knee to knee. They had their black stockings rolled down below their knees. They looked like fisherwomen on some little village. And I said, Bill Shore, Ruth Nussensweig, and she stuck up her hand, and I took it and I shook it. She said, "I'm not shaking. I need help standing up." And she was, she's in her 80s now, and she's still at this.
She's still working in a bench lab.
She's still working in a bench lab.
Well, I don't want to give away too much of this book in case there's somebody here who actually wants to buy your book. But describe the scene and the place where these clinical trials are going on.
Well, when you do clinical trials, there's this thing called hotel challenges. So what happens is, and the way they first developed this vaccine was they literally took a lot of mosquitoes, they radiated them, and then they put a box of them on Steve Hoffman's arm with 14 other volunteers. And they let them bite away for an hour until they had so many bites, the equivalent of 1,000 bites, which is what would give you immunity if you were an adult. If you were a child, it would probably kill you, but if you were an adult, it would give you immunity, to see if this actually worked as an immunogen, and it did. And so then now they've created trials where they, obviously they can.
How long does it take to get 1,000 mosquito bites?
Oh, they bite pretty quick. Yeah, an hour or two.
Would you do that?
No.
Yeah.
No.
So it seems like you need another qualified, not in addition to unreasonable and brave, or unreasonable.
Yeah, something like that. But so they did that. But so now
it's a box.
It's a box.
A bunch of mosquitoes in it, strapped to your arm.
Yes.
Have you seen it? Have you actually seen it?
I have. So and so the first time they did it, they all went through about 5 or 6 days and thought it worked great. And then Steve got on a plane to give a speech in San Diego, and he got violently ill with malaria. And he realized that it hadn't worked, and then they redid it, and they finally got it right. Now, of course, it's via injection, and so the clinical trials they're in, it gives you an injection. And the scene I think you were talking about is the volunteers for this, who are, you're kind of, I guess, casting some aspersions about who would do this. But the volunteers...
No, not at all.
It's actually,
it's the history of medicine.
It's history of medicine. Well, then they go to a hotel, and they live at a hotel for 10 days. At about 2 weeks after they get immunized, they check into a hotel, and then at the period where they're most likely to actually manifest symptoms, present with symptoms of the disease, a doc comes and takes their blood 2 or 3 times a day, and their temperature and their blood pressure and so forth. And that's how they decide whether this works. Steve created this vaccine, this connection between Ruth Nussensweig and Steve. He did it with a total of 14 people, and 13 of whom were protected. And he built his entire business. I mean, that's what's fascinating to me about a man who's been able to parlay a test, as I say in the book, smaller than a little league team, basically. 13 people out of 14. GlaxoSmithKline is now in trials in Africa with 17,000 children under the age of 5 who they're immunizing. And Steve will eventually have to get there, but he's raised hundreds of millions of dollars based on these 13 out of 14 being protected.
But describe some of the setbacks in clinical trials as well, because you're dealing with bureaucracies that are concerned about the way the trial is going, not necessarily looking for adverse impact, but looking for other things that could shut them down.
No, that's right. Well, between the Food and Drug Administration and the National Institutes of Health, you have to follow a protocol for these trials, and if one little thing goes off, then the whole trial comes at risk. So they did have a number of reversals in these trials, and even at the level that they're doing them now with injections, they weren't satisfied with the results. And so Steve is now trying to see if he could administer the vaccine through IV. Now, who would go and that's probably second worst to getting, be on the table for an hour, get an IV injection of a vaccine. And when you think of just how you would deliver that, but again, he's trying to prove the concept that as an immunogen this works, and that we'll find the right way to get it.
And what's the status of the clinical trials?
His he's kind of in a David and Goliath battle with GlaxoSmithKline. His trials are in their very first phase, so very early. And the first phase of trials are really designed just to show that it is safe. They're not even designed to show that it's effective. They're designed to show that it is safe, that you will not get, that it won't do the opposite, kind of do no harm, that you won't get sick from taking this vaccine. And so they're in the first phase. GlaxoSmithKline is now in the third phase, and the final phase. And if their trial is successful, they'll take their drug to market.
And they'll beat it.
Well, he doesn't really think they will, because their drug is at best 50% successful. So I think people would say, yeah, if you could save 50% of the kids who are at risk, great, but we've still got to come up with a vaccine that saves all of them.
So why don't they just invest the money and do it together with him?
Well, they're so competitive, neither of them believes much in the other's vaccine.
So there's more than just one unreasonable man in this story?
There's more than one.
I can imagine. Let me go quickly here. Again, it's back to what we were talking about as well, the political environment working counter to objections. And we heard a little bit about the United States, some of the challenges you faced. Outside the United States, beyond Haiti, what are some of the challenges that you faced with hunger relief for this anti-malarial?
Well, I think there's actually, I'll briefly address both because I know we're running out of time. With hunger, you can go to a lot of countries where you can find great organizations doing great work, but they tend not to be indigenous to those countries. They tend to be outsiders coming in, who I think it's going to be very, very difficult for them to create any kind of lasting base of effective work. So I mentioned in Ethiopia, Share Strength funds organizations that are not U.S. organizations or Canadian organizations or whoever. We fund organizations of Ethiopian men and women who started an organization because they have to be much closer, obviously, to what would work in their country and in their culture than we could possibly be. So there aren't enough of those. I mean, there needs to be there's a lot of support for Western organizations going into these countries. There's got to be more support for these countries, I think, developing their own resources, just as you were asking here in the United States with social entrepreneurs, who's helping them while colleges are creating courses. We've got to find ways to support that. And then on the malaria issue, as we said before, ultimately African governments are going to have to really create public health infrastructures. And there's a few countries that are good at that. There's a lot that are not.
So you've been successful, Billy. Aren't you, your life story, a case in point, an argument against the proposition of this book? You're not unreasonable.
Well, at times I can be, but no, I think we've still got a long way to go. I wouldn't.
So it isn't actually, it's not an essential ingredient of success to be unreasonable.
No, but I was with the mayor of Los Angeles a couple weeks ago, Antonio Villagrosa, and he told me that on the night he was elected victor, his mother's words rang in his ear, which was, "Do not declare your success, declare your purpose." I think that's good advice because we've still got a long way to go with our purpose.
And so your purpose is still centrally hunger relief.
That's right. That's right. We've got a long way to go to get that done. I mean, we think we'll be successful with kids in this country, and I think that will give us both the, the resources and the credibility and the support to then go climb the next higher hill, because even once we solve this problem for children, there's a lot of Americans who are, particularly today, and everybody saw the unemployment statistics that came out at the end of last week, and there's an enormous number of people who are really hurting and who are finding themselves navigating these systems for the first time. When you go to talk about people who are getting food stamps, Tom Vilsack, we had breakfast with him at the Regency Hotel last week, and he told us that only 10% of the people on food stamps.
It's an interesting place for breakfast to talk about.
Well, most of your former Senate colleagues are there
raising money.
That's why we did it there. But only 10% of the people on food stamps are unemployed. 90% of the people on food stamps, and we have a record 42 million Americans on food stamps today. Fully half of those 42 million being children. But of those who are not children, of the 21 million who are adults, 90% of them are in working families. So we've got a lot of push to help.
So just in this last week, we see an example where you've got a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate wanted to pass a tax bill that didn't extend the Bush tax cuts to people over $250,000 a year, and they were unwilling to fund an extension of unemployment benefits for 13 months unless it was paid for. How does that set of facts affect you? Is it one of? I mean,
well, I'll tell you another one. The Child Nutrition Reauthorization Bill, that
right.
$4.5 billion increase in funding for children. $2.5 billion of it comes from food stamp benefits. So they took money away from people on food stamp future benefits to fund this. So and as you know, because you've done a lot of work on the deficit in particular, I mean, there aren't easy answers to this, and it seems like our political leaders are not gravitating towards the tough answers either. So I think we're in for a rough time.
Right, but it seems to me it's an exceptionally good example of where the people with a voice shouted down the people that are voiceless.
Oh, that's right. That's right. That's right. And I think it's going to, I mean, I really believe it's going to take civic society. I think it's going to take the nonprofit sector. I think it's going to take the academic community to be that voice. I mean, probably more important than anything else we do. The money we raise, the money we grant out, all of that. I think being that voice.
But isn't it hard? I'm not optimistic the academic community is going to do it based upon my experience. Not here, by the way, but working with the University of Nebraska for 16 years. The president will tell you privately what his political views are, but publicly he's afraid to tell because he's got to go to a conservative board of regents. He's afraid they're going to fire him. So, don't you find the same thing even in the donor community, in the not-for-profit world? Some concern about getting a little bit too far out there for fear of the political consequences of doing so?
Oh, sure, there's some of that, and I think to be effective politically, you can't be too far at either extreme. But again, I think if people push themselves to say, who is it that we're supposed to be representing here? Why did we start this organization in the first place? There's nothing easier, as you know. When you think of, you've probably got Senate colleagues who once they got there, they decided, unlike you, all they wanted to do was be there for the rest of their life, right? And that then changes the way you do everything else. I think it's the same is true in the nonprofit sector and other organizations. You have to, I think you've got to really stay focused on why are you doing this.
Let me approach just on one last topic. I've got all the questions on the cards, I believe, answered. So if somebody wants to, oh my God.
Hi, I'm the hearing access program. You talked about pragmatic solutions and presenting. I'm curious, how are you going to do that? I've been, as former Senator Kerrey knows, the ear symbol back here is one of our successes, and one of pretty much most of the ear symbols you see around New York City are our successes, including part of President Obama's stimulus package. How do I now take that and leverage that into, just as you said, scaling that up? I've been doing that. We're completely nonprofit for all the reasons that you said. And how do I do cause-related marketing?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that there's a shortcut to scaling it up. So we've, at Share Strength, we've built piece upon piece upon piece, and we've thought in terms of concentric circles. How do we always reach out to that next circle and let them know of our success, and then reach out to that next circle? I don't know that there's a shortcut to that. With cost-related marketing, I do think that, a lot of organizations, I don't know enough about yours, but so many more organizations that are doing it now are poised to do it. And what it takes, I think, is two things. It takes having assets that you think might be leverageable into value with a potential corporate partner. And so we have and if you go on the kind of the Community Wealth Ventures website, we have a number of free downloadable tools that help organizations inventory their assets, think about what the value might be. But it also takes a sense of kind of a cultural recasting. So when you think of partnership, if you sit down with a business partner that could be a cause-related marketing partner, you spend as much time trying to learn about their business objectives to see if your assets can be deployed to serve those as you do talking to them about your passion for your mission. So in a partnership, both sides have to get value from it. And I feel like in our world, in the nonprofit world that I've been in and you've been in for a long time, we tend not to be as reflexively good at that. We tend to be so excited about what we're doing that we forget that our partners have to be getting something out of it as well. And I'm glad to talk to you offline about some of the ways that we've helped organizations do that.
Yes.
I work with Wellness in the Schools, which is a nonprofit organization here in the city, getting fresh and real foods into the public schools. And we're struggling with, how do you define an end to hunger? Is a full belly just mean you're not hungry, or is it real food? How do you get the government to spend money on local produce as opposed to frozen mozzarella sticks?
Yeah.
This guy's a terrible eating habits. I'm trying to get it down.
Bob knows my eating habits better than he should. Well, I think that we've come up with our own definition for ending hunger because there aren't very good definitions out there, and the government uses what is called a food insecurity index based on questions they take on to Census Bureau surveys and ask families questions about, is there a certain time of the month where you may not feel that you have enough resources to feed your kids nutritiously. The proxy that we've come up with, simply because it's so measurable and it's not the end-all and be-all, but it's the one that we're using for now, is if you could get the percentage of these kids that are eligible for these programs actually enrolled in them. We have such a long, long way to go. In Louisiana, I mentioned I was in New Orleans last week. In Louisiana last week, 6.7% of the kids in the whole state, this is much bigger than the 32,000 for New Orleans, only 6.7% of the kids get summer meals. So New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu turned to me and said, one of my campaign promises, which I'm in the process of fulfilling, is we're going to build a playground next to every school. Is there any reason that those playgrounds in the summertime couldn't be used to serve meals? And of course, they're not. It's a great idea. But when I say 6.7% are participating, the ceiling is so far from where we are now that even if the budget was cut, even if we had all these other obstacles, we know that we could double, triple, quadruple that. So that's our definition. In terms of the quality of the meals, there's a huge movement going on now, as you know, and as you're part of, to change that. We were in a school in Washington, D.C., a charter school, just a couple weeks ago. It's called the Elsie Whitlow Stokes School. And the charter school was founded with a chef. The woman, the educator who started this school, started with the chef. They built a kitchen. Most schools today don't have kitchens, right? Most schools have a hot box that can reheat something. So schools don't have kitchens. And because this woman was a chef, she knows how to go out and purchase fresh produce. They grow a little bit there, but not enough to be meaningful. But she's smart about how she buys things. She told us, she said, please don't ever repeat this. So nobody repeat this. They're making money on the program. They're actually able to provide meals. Most people think that it's too expensive to do this. They're doing it in a way that is below the amount that they get federal subsidized, which is like $2.80 a kid or something like that. So they're actually making money, which they're investing back in the school meals program. So there are some ways to do this. I think it's coming to the schools fast and hard in a really good way.
One last question. Yes.
My question was, when you were writing the book, what was your hope that the reader would feel, or what would you want? What were your hopes to ignite within the reader in writing the book?
That's a great question. I probably had a lot of hopes, but I would say the central hope was that people would realize it. And what I came to realize that I think has just taught me a lot is that when we fail at something, we tend to think it's a failure of resources or finances or planning or strategy, or we always find something out there to point our finger to. And I conclude that most failures are really failures of imagination, and that they're a failure to make that leap that, we actually can do this. So I was, a few minutes ago, saying that when Melinda Gates talked about eradicating malaria in 2007, it was the first time literally that anybody had used, in the malaria community, had used that word in 30 years. It was called the E word. It was not allowed to be spoken because people thought it was just such a high-risk strategy. When we talked about ending hunger, everybody was against it at first. But then people come around. So this notion that, you know, that you've got to break through your own failures of imagination, and that what you imagine can happen, and that there's a future out there that, you know, we can imagine that, you know, it may not be within our grasp today, but that we're capable of achieving it, I think just empowers people to bring the best of themselves to whatever they're doing. So it's a great last question.
I do not think we can end on a better answer than that. So,
Thank you.
Billy, thank you for all the